Professor Lundestad, thank you very much for being here with us tonight. My first question is, for years economists have been predicting that China will overtake the US. These sorts of predictions were made equally about the Soviet Union, which ultimately proved to be wrong, and then about Japan, whose growth slowed sharply in the 1990s. Do you think same thing will happen to China? And if not, what makes China different?
Yes, you're right. The predictions were wrong about the Soviet Union, China, the EU, overtaking the US in great power terms. And now we see the same predictions about China. What is different now is that China is, at least economically, much closer than any of these powers were. They're closer to overtaking the US. Because if growth rates are maintained in China and they continue with the same low growth rates as we see in the United States, this will happen within a relatively few years. That is the big difference.
There's no doubt that the Chinese economy is growing at a rapid rate, but what are the short-term and long-term issues that China needs to address in order to sustain the current level of growth?
Well, I should emphasize that when and if China surpasses the US in GDP terms, we are talking about total GDP. We are not talking about GDP per person, because China has a population 4 times larger than that of the US. So on a per capita basis, China will remain a relatively poor country, and this will have consequences too internationally, because China will not get the full benefit of having the largest economy as long as its people are still relatively poor by American standards. So China has much to do, and there are many challenges here. In the long run, it will be impossible for China to maintain the kind of high growth rates we've been talking about. But I think they will be able to maintain them long enough to surpass the US. What will then happen? Who knows? But there are many structural problems in the Chinese economy, and the long-term problems are, maybe most of all, demography. I mean, China has a very unbalanced population as a result of the one-child policy. And there will be a shortage of labor in many parts of China soon. This is already beginning to happen because the population is getting old. China is getting old before it gets rich. This will be a huge challenge. And there are many other challenges for China. Education is making huge progress, but will China be able to develop an educational system that rivals that of the US? That is quite a challenge, even for the very long term.
In your lecture, you mentioned that no country remains #1 forever. So, should the US accommodate China's rise? If so, how? And if not, why?
Well, it is accommodating the Chinese rise to some extent. It has to. It happens every day. I mean, the US is dependent on China to some extent. It is borrowing money from China. China has to invest in the US. And China is giving an increasing role in the international system. I mean, the World Bank and the IMF and all this. And I think to some extent the US is prepared to face the consequences of this. But in great power terms, I do not think that the United States is prepared to give China the full role it expects in its region. And this could lead to serious problems. I don't think it will lead to war, because they are very dependent on each other, and none of them has an interest in war. But I think it's likely it will lead to increased problems compared to the situation we have today.
Professor Lundestad, thank you very much.